Hi everyone, Chaya here. Welcome to my channel. As many of you may know, I love researching Mesoamerican history, and today I'd like to share all the different books I've read on the subject so far. I get a lot of questions about my book recommendations and where to start, so I hope sharing my journey will help you start your own as well. Pre-Hispanic history is so beautiful and I hope it receives more love. Without further ado, let's get started. My interest in Mesoamerican history started after I fell in love with MajoraZ from Fate Grand Order, and I was so obsessed with him that I needed to learn more about his world. But during this time, I had no idea where to begin. I knew nothing about the cultures of ancient Mexico, and I didn't even know what I wanted to learn. So I just went to my local library and I looked up the word Mesoamerica into the search results, and ta-da! This was the first thing I found. The Handbook of Mesoamerican Mythology by Jason J. Gonzalez and K. Almir Reed. I snatched it off the shelf, checked it out, and that is how my journey began. And it worked out perfectly because I do consider this to be a perfect entry point into the history of Mesoamerica. This book gives you an overview of the creation myths and stories of the Mayan and Nahua worlds. And when I say Nahua, I'm talking about the people that lived in central Mexico. You might know them as the Aztec. It's complicated. Towards the end of the book, there is a glossary of different figures, both mythological and historical, of both Maya and Nahua origin, which is very helpful as you familiarize yourself with names and concepts. I actually wrote notes on all the stories and figures, which you can find linked in the description. All in all, I like how this book gives you a broad overview of Mesoamerica, which is a giant subject, and for me, it served to provide most of my foundational knowledge about it. From there, I knew what topics I wanted to seek further. If you're like my past self and have no idea where to start or what interests you, I highly recommend this book. From there, you can pick and choose where you want to further your studies, whether it be the Mayans, the Aztecs, certain figures, etc. For me, I initially wanted to learn more about the Mayans because MajoraZ is Mayan, but as I read through the book, I felt myself resonating a lot more with the Nahua culture simply because some of the myths and traditions described really brought me back to the stories that my mom would tell me when I was a kid. All of these old wives' tales that I continue to hear to this day from my parents, I was so surprised to find out that they must have originated from pre-Hispanic times. And it makes sense because my family is from Guerrero, Mexico, which was an area that the Nahua people inhabited and continue to inhabit to this day. But out of all the myths and figures I read about, there was one that stood out to me the most. That is Quetzalcoatl. Quite frankly, he made me laugh so much with the stories and I thought it was pretty neat. Which leads me to my next book, El Regreso de Quetzalcoatl, Una Historia Sagrada de México by Juan Miguel Zunzunegui. This was another find at my local library after I searched up Quetzalcoatl in the catalog. Side note, I know a lot of us are used to just going on Amazon and buying any book you want, but I highly recommend visiting your local library. You'll not only find one book, but you'll find plenty more within the subject and even find some hidden gems. The best part? It's free! Now back to the book. I credit this book for really igniting my love for Quetzalcoatl. It single-handedly sent me deep into the rabbit hole. You'll note it's in Spanish, and that's where the perks of being bilingual comes in. Since we're dealing with Mexico's history, naturally there will be many Spanish-only sources. If you are English-only, feel free to skip to this timestamp, but you're more than welcome to stick around too. In summary, this book takes you through a journey of Mexico's history, from the first civilizations to modern times, and it's all centered around Quetzalcoatl. You'll learn how his legend develops with the early peoples and how he is adopted by later groups, ultimately spreading all over Mesoamerica. And I think it was in chapter 4 when the author goes deep into the symbolism of Quetzalcoatl and what he represents, and I just started crying. I was able to finally understand the nature of this figure and the beauty he represents, like how he's your precious twin and humanity's biggest advocate, inspiring you to be your best self. The author has such a lovely style of writing as he synthesizes both the Old and New World histories and their convergence upon contact. But one thing I must note is that the Aztecs are portrayed in a pretty bad light, and as we research this subject, we must be very careful because many times the demonization of the Aztecs leads to a justification of the conquest. And as we'll see in later books, the conquest was a literal crime against humanity and should never be justified. So, just a thing to watch out for as you read any sort of material, it's important to understand the full picture and context of the Aztec people before jumping to conclusions about them being quote-unquote bad. Other than that, this was a marvelous read and it led me straight into my next book, The Myth of Quetzalcoatl, Religion, Rulership, and History in the Nahua World by Alfredo Lopez Austin. This book is originally in Spanish, but I read the English translation by Russ Davidson and Guilhem Olivier. At this point, I was foaming at the mouth, desperate to learn even more about Quetzalcoatl. Unlike previous titles, I stumbled upon this book online. When I searched for it at my local library, I couldn't find it, so this is one of the few books I bought, and I'm glad I did. Why? Because this book is dense with information, and I ended up filling it with notes and highlights. I believe this has been the most informative book I have read so far just because of the sheer amount of content and analysis of the culture. In summary, this book aims to understand the nature of Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, the priest king of Toyan, not to be confused with Quetzalcoatl. I know it's complicated, but we'll cover it in another video. The author achieves this by analyzing the role of religion, exploring the life of various rulers and figures, and retelling the general history of the Nahua world, much like the title itself describes. I ended up learning a lot about Mesoamerican cosmology, like how they viewed time in a cyclical manner instead of linear, and the concept of hombre dioses and their significance to religion and society. With so much to learn, I highly recommend this book, but only if you already have foundational knowledge on the subject. I do not recommend it as a first read for beginners simply because of how dense it is. Even with my foundational knowledge, I still struggled to keep up with certain names and concepts. But once you're ready to dive in, you'll find this book to be extremely rewarding. 10 out of 10. Right after I finished The Myth of Quetzalcoatl, I came across this tweet from one of my pals on Twitter, Aztec Empire. He mentioned a recently published book by Camilla Townsend titled The Aztec Myths. My immediate thought was, aha! There's my next read. I promptly checked it out at my library and dove right in. What immediately stood out to me was Townsend's style of writing. It's very easy to follow, and I quickly found myself immersed in her writing. It was definitely a much more casual read compared to the trenches I found myself in the previous book. In fact, I consider this to be a great introductory book along with the Handbook of Mesoamerican Mythology. Townsend gave a very good summary of various myths, histories, and culture in the Aztec world. In my case, since I had been studying Mesoamerica for a while now, I found a lot of the content presented here more like a review, but although it was more of a supplemental read to me, it was a pleasant read nonetheless. I still learned a few things here and there, and I enjoyed seeing different perspectives on tales that I was already familiar with. Townsend easily became one of my favorite authors, and we'll cover another one of her works later on in this video. Overall, whether you're a beginner or a veteran like me, you'll definitely enjoy the Aztec Myths. My next find was this beautiful gem, the Codex Borgia by Giselle Diaz and Ellen Rogers. Once again, I found this at one of my libraries and snatched it. I was really excited about this one because the Codex Borgia had served as a great source of inspiration for my art, especially during Inktober when I drew a different Aztec god every day. Being one of the few surviving pre-Hispanic codices, it has such a unique art style that I have never seen anywhere else. It's nothing short of fascinating to me. The pictures in this book are actually taken from a recreation of the original codex. It was beautifully remade from scratch in the style of the original piece. The art was all hand-painted onto traditionally handcrafted paper and arranged in an accordion style, as was the custom. Once complete, it was stored in an ornate specially made box. As you flip through the pages, all of the illustrations leave you with a sense of awe as you see the intricacies of the designs and the detail that was put into each illustration. The artistic talent of these native cultures is breathtaking. In addition to the images, the book comes with an introduction covering the history of the codex itself. Following the introduction, you get into a summary/analysis of each of the different plates, in other words, pages. This was the hard part. It's dense. You'll find yourself flipping back and forth between the plate illustration and the description due to them being on separate pages, so that was kind of tricky but overall a fun experience. Due to the complexity of the codex itself, you won't be leaving this book understanding the codex completely, but I think it does a great job giving you a general understanding of what is depicted in each plate. During Aztec times, priests dedicated their whole life to understanding and interpreting the codices, so if you don't quite understand what the heck you just read, don't worry, it's neither yours nor the book's fault. But all in all, if you're intrigued about the codices and want to check out a primary historical source, definitely check out the Codex Borgia. After the Codex Borgia, I went back to Camilla Townsend with their best-selling book, Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs. I had heard a lot of good things about this book, particularly how it presents the conquest, so naturally I was curious. Luckily, I had grabbed it along with the Codex Borgia from the library. Not gonna lie, I was pretty nervous about this read. This was the first book in my research journey that actually dove into the conquest. And for the longest time, I had been evading this topic. Subconsciously, I wanted to run away as much as possible because just thinking about the conquest made me nauseous. It's such a weird feeling, I don't like it at all. However, I felt it was time to face my fears. I like how Townsend presented this historical period from the point of the Aztec people, which is unlike a lot of popular sources where the focus is on the conquerors. And as I mentioned before, Townsend has such a beautiful way of writing that allows you to put yourself in the shoes of the people of that time. It's almost as if you can jump into the pages and walk those very same rails of Tenochtitlan. You can look around and see all the beautiful buildings, hear all the different sounds of birds, music, and people singing around the campfire, telling stories of their history and world. It's a wonderful experience. The book recounts the entire history of the Mexica, aka the Aztecs, beginning from their earliest migrations to their rise to power and their eventual demise. As you approach the later chapters focusing on the conquest, it becomes more and more heartbreaking. You really gotta steel yourself for this one. Upon completion, I was just left with this empty feeling, the kind of empty feeling after watching a tragic movie where everything the main characters held dear had been stripped away and burned, and you're just left looking out into the distance with hollow eyes, thinking that it's never gonna be the same, and then you kind of realize that everything that transpired in this book is true, and we are living with those same scars to this day. Anyways, it was a great read, totally recommend, 10 out of 10. So yeah, those were the books I read within the span of about a year. But those weren't the only sources I studied. I'd like to share a few supplemental materials I found helpful during my journey. First on the list is Mexico lore. Basically, whenever I have a random question, like for example, did the Aztecs use chairs? Yes, I had to search that once. Mexico lore is the one to save the day. They have plenty of articles covering all kinds of topics, and they're all super accessible with a simple search. If you have a question, Mexico lore most likely has some sort of answer. Next is Arqueología Mexicana, which is a magazine published in part by INA, the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico. This is a resource in Spanish, but since it's online, you can use a translation tool to ease the language barrier. Much like Mexico lore, they have a plethora of articles covering all kinds of archaeological topics. You could also purchase their more in-depth magazine for as little as $5. I personally own a few issues myself. Another resource I recommend is MajoraZ over on Twitter. Majora creates amazing in-depth posts and graphics about Mesoamerica, frequently debunking common myths and stereotypes that have permeated the space. Go check them out. Finally, I recommend the Aztec Empire comic, by Paul Guignan and David Hahn, hosted over at BigRedHair.com. The comic is free to read and covers the history of the conquest. For me, this has been an incredible visual resource because it portrays the colorful world of Mesoamerica in a very authentic way. Definitely check it out. All of these resources are freely accessible, and I will link them in the description below. I hope you find all these sources helpful. To end this video, I'd like to share some books on my bucket list. The first one is Quetzalcoatl, the once and future Lord of the Toltecs by H.B. Nicholson. Yes, my craving for Quetz is still unsatiable, specifically for Topiltzin because he's such a mysterious figure and he's been the source of much confusion when speaking about Quetzalcoatl. He's actually the reason many people think Quetz is white. This book summarizes and analyzes every account of his story throughout Mesoamerica, and I'm looking forward to it. The other book I want to read is Tezcatlipoca, Burlas y Metamorfosis de un Dios Azteca by Olivier Guilhem. This book is in Spanish, but there is also an English translated version titled Mockeries and Metamorphoses of an Aztec God, Tezcatlipoca. I personally will be reading the original Spanish version. I'm looking forward to this read because Tezcatlipoca is a god I'm still trying to understand fully, and with him being linked to his brother Quetzalcoatl, naturally I want to learn more. One more book I'd like to check out is Aztec City-State Capitals by Michael E. Smith. I've seen it at my library and it looks like a great resource for understanding Mesoamerican life and society, especially for someone like me who's trying to world build in a Mesoamerican setting. There's a lot of resources covering cities like Tenochtitlan, but Smith dives into other settlements not commonly talked about, giving a holistic understanding of the ancient world. And that's it! Thank you for watching my video! I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope this helps you begin your own journey into the world of Mesoamerica. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. My next video will revolve around the design process of my OC Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl for my fic titled Eternal Sunshine of the Fifth Sun. I'll be going over all aspects of his design and giving historical context for all of his clothing and accessories. So I hope you guys find that interesting. You can turn on the notification bell so you know exactly when that drops. Thanks again for stopping by. Until next time, bye bye!